clever idea, but it's quite a complicated one to say to people as they get all the numbers and the letters muddled up. So it wasn't terribly good. I do have Jane Hart, but that's really a personal one. So professionally, connect with me. I'm known as C for LPT. I work internationally with organizations and help them understand new trends and technologies. That's my daytime job, really. And I also work internationally with a group of people known as the Internet Time Alliance. And Harold, of course, is one of my colleagues in the Internet Time Alliance. And it's great to have him here today. We do work together on different projects. And some of the work that we've done helping people understand, in particular, the new social and collaborative trends and technologies, appears in my recent handbook that I created called the Social Learning Handbook. And Harold has contributed a chapter in it there as well. And the subtitle of that handbook is The Next Generation Learning Practices in the Age of Knowledge Sharing and Collaboration. And that's what I've used as the title for this presentation. So what I wanted to do today was to kind of give you a flavor of some of the stuff that we've done and we talk about and in the book. It's also a continuation of the webinar I did back in January, but I recognize that some people won't necessarily have seen that, so I'll go back a bit and repeat some of the important points to set the context before I go forward. But before I do that, I just want to ask you a question. Now, this may have come up during the week, I don't know, but I'm going to ask you a question and see if you know the answer. What happened on the 12th of March, 1989? Anybody want to suggest? Maybe you know. Maybe. Shout out, anybody? Does this picture help you? That's Tim Berners-Lee, the British physicist working at CERN in Switzerland. And on that date, he put forward his proposal for what turned out to be the World Wide Web. In those days, it was an information management system for physicists pretty much to share what they were doing in CERN and across the world. But of course, that then turned into the web. Now, obviously, the first web servers didn't appear to say a couple of years later. But 25 years ago, this March, it's been commemorated the fact that the web's been around for 25 years. And I think during that time, there can be very few people whose lives haven't been influenced by the web in some way or other, whether it's just to improve their shopping experience or meeting up with friends. But of course, it's also influenced a lot of other things. And in particular, it's also influencing the way that we as individuals are thinking about learning. And I've been tracking, if you like, the changes that I'm seeing in the way people are learning over the last few years through this activity that I've been carrying out, which I call the Top 100 Tools for Learning. Now, this will be, in 2014, will be the 8th year I've done it. But back in the very first year, it was just a little idea that was given to me to ask learning professionals around the world, what tools they were using. And so I ran it for the first time for 3 weeks in July, I think it was 2007, and created a list of tools. And it actually became quite popular. So I did it the next year, and then the next year, and so forth. So now it's been going, I'd say, for nearly 8 years. I've just opened up again for the voting for 2014. So if you'd like to participate and contribute, please do just go to the website I've just showed you, and you'll find the link there, easy to do so. And what I've asked is that people, learning professionals, kind of give me some way of validating who they are, so I know that it's not some vendor trying to game the whole system. So there is a little bit of manual intervention on my part to ensure that the results come out fairly. Now, for those of you who haven't seen the list, and I don't know how many, let's see, let me ask you, how many of you have seen the Top 100 Tools list? Okay, well, that's a good number, but there was also a fair few people there who haven't seen it. So what I'm going to do, I can't go through all 100 tools here. I'm going to show you the top 10 from last year. And you may well be a little bit surprised if you haven't seen that list, because right at that very top is Twitter. And I have to tell you that Twitter was well ahead of any of the other tools behind it. And looking down that list, can you see any tool there that looks like a traditional training or learning or dedicated learning tool? No, the first one that actually appears is Moodle, which comes in about 11, I think. But what is clear over the last few years is that people are using these tools. I should say that people can nominate to 10 tools for either for their own personal learning or for creating learning for others. And what's clear that the outcome of these trends, if you like, over the last 7 or 8 years is that clearly more people are taking control of their own learning and using tools which are not necessarily learning tools anymore. They're general purpose tools. And often people say to me, but that's not right, is it? But for me, actually, it's the beauty of the whole thing, that these tools are being used now not just as personal tools to connect with friends and whatever, but they're actually used within a business and a learning context. Now, in the webinar, I went through all the trends I was seeing and how people were using these tools. I don't want to say all that all over again, so please take a look at the webinar recording if you'd like to see more. But I just want to say 3 things, because I think they are quite key to the message that I want to give you today. Now, the way people are taking control of their learning is in a number of different ways. Clearly, one of those is that as individuals, we're now using the web to participate in much wider educational opportunities online. And in recent years, of course, the whole MOOC movement has meant that anybody can pretty much sign up for a course at a university or an education establishment anywhere in the world. But in fact, it's not just courses that people now see as opportunities for learning. They're using resources in all different formats: videos, screencasts, podcasts, all kinds of things. And in many cases, they're using resources that have been created by other individuals, which have been freely and willingly shared on the web. They're not necessarily coming from mainstream educational providers. But more than this, what is increasingly clear, and you can see that from the top 10 list, is that many of us are now using social networking sites like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Google+, to build a professional network of trusted friends and colleagues. And for many of us, these social networks have become an important part of our personal lives as they let us make global connections with other people, other individuals around the world. And in fact, as you know, many people refer to them as their personal learning networks, or PLNs, because in many cases, if people have a learning and performance problem, they actually turn first to their professional network for help, rather than going online to find some resource. And looking at the way people are using these networks, I'm seeing a very different sort of pattern of use. When people contribute to the top 100 tools list, they can actually, if they want to, say how they're using the tools. So I could see the trends in terms of how they're using networks to ask questions of one another and exchange resources and ideas, brainstorm with one another, solve problems, but keep up to date with what their colleagues are doing. That's really one of the key things that comes out of it. And often people say they're actually learning from one another, often without even realizing it. So just being in a network, they are just being immersed in a learning environment that they weren't even aware of, really. And building professional networks is actually becoming quite important. many organizations I know seem to think that, that going on Twitter or Google Plus or whatever it is just wasting time. But for many professionals now, I expect many of you to, like me, this is just an extremely invaluable part of their life. In fact, I probably couldn't even be here talking to you about it unless I was tapped into so many people around the world finding out what they're doing. And in fact, Ken Perlman, who wrote in the Forbes magazine fairly recently, says that he thinks a new era is emerging, the era of the knowledgeable networker. People who learn, think, and work very differently. And he says that knowledgeable networkers are very good at what they do, but at the same time, they don't pretend to know it all. They're very good at putting pieces of the puzzle together. And as he points out, they know a lot of people and have a lot of information resources. And that just bears out what I've just been sharing with you, that nowadays the knowledgeable worker, who could be a knowledge worker, but could well be anybody in any profession, any industry, is having access to many resources and many people. And in fact, in a recent book, well, a fairly recent book called The Hidden Power of Social Networks, the authors, Rob Cross and Andrew Parker, actually explain that by analyzing networks, we learned that individual expertise did not distinguish people as high performers. What distinguished them were larger and more diversified personal networks. Now, when I go to conferences and speak about this, I talk about how important Twitter is, particularly for me. As I said, I'm pretty much there all the time, and I'm listening into what's happening. I'm tapped into what people are doing. And then there's usually somebody who puts up their hand and says, but I wouldn't like my doctor to have been trained on Twitter. And I say, well, of course that's true, but I think that that's actually missing the point. It's not actually using Twitter to become a doctor. It's about using Twitter to become a better doctor, or at least a better informed doctor. Because in every profession, particularly, and medicine included, it's important to keep up to date with what's happening in the medical profession, reading out about new medical interventions and ideas and so forth. And in fact, back in, I think it was September 2012, a Journal on Medical Internet Research says that something like 25% of doctors were using social media to scan and explore new medical information. Now that was, I say, September 2012, so it's probably increased in number by now. But as I point out, social media is not going to replace traditional means of research. It's an additional and valuable channel that can add to a physician's knowledge base. And of course, as I said, that's how many of us are using these networks, whether we're conscious of it or not. And I kind of term that learning the new. And I think that learning the new for anybody is not about just going to, say, an annual conference anymore or reading a few industry magazines. It's about using your social networks and other resources to continuously keep up to date with what's happening in your industry and profession. By learning the new, I don't necessarily mean what's new to us as an individual, but what's new to the world. New thinking on old or existing bodies of knowledge, as well as new thinking and new bodies of knowledge which haven't actually yet been kind of codified into bodies of knowledge. So it's about keeping up to date with what's happening and the flow of new information. And John C.D. Brown, who I'm sure you know, he's an author, he's a thinker, in a conference presentation back in 2012, talks about this, and the same sort of idea, and he refers to it as entrepreneurial learning. And he says that it's not about becoming an entrepreneur. It's about how do you constantly look around you all the time for new ways, new resources to learn new things. And points out that, like, as I've mentioned, in the networked age, it almost gives us unlimited possibilities. And what he does, he uses the analogy of the whitewater kayaker to explain how entrepreneurial learning works, or learning the new, as I would call it, works. So instead of being like a steamship that sets sail for a long time in a very prescribed way, and he says that it's authoritatively transferred in delivery mode. So learning is not sort of just continue in a very steamship type way, but this whitewater kayaker participates in the ever-moving flows of activities and knowledge, because in this new world of flows, participating is an active sport. And I think that sums it up pretty well. For many of us who are out there on the social web, it does feel like you're out in the turbulent waters of things that are happening. Learning out there is very different from learning in a classroom or in a course where everything has been prescribed for you in a very linear way. Here you're out there gathering pieces of information, having to join the dots, make sense of it all. It's a very different way of learning. So the question is, why is it important? Why should we do this? Why shouldn't we wait until everything has been codified for us and then we'll learn it that way? Well, I'm going to give you a few facts and figures here, because why I think it's important for us as individuals to do this. And these are facts and figures that I've accumulated from different places. The first of all, it's clear that people are saying that with our knowledge and skills, our own knowledge and skills will be out of date within 5 years. Things are changing so fast that within 5 years, what we know now, what skills we have, will no longer be relevant. And when we think about education, some people go as far as to say a college degree will be out of date before the loan is paid off. And the whole world of work is changing. Harold will tell you a lot about this. That's one of his key things. There's no longer going to be a job for life, even if there is now. I don't know whether there is. Only a life of jobs. And in fact, it's estimated that current students will have more than 10 jobs by the time they're 38. So it's going to be up to every one of us, every individual, to remain marketable, to acquire the new skills that we need to get the new jobs. So how do we do this? What does that mean? Here comes the picture of Harold. Harold says that we need to create our own processes to do that. Not something that's a recipe that we all have to follow. We have to create our own processes, which he calls personal knowledge management. And you probably heard him speak about that, or you probably heard him read something about it. But it's important for us to do that ourselves to help each of us make sense of the world and work more effectively. So learning the new is part of this whole process of making sense of what we see and hear. He has developed a framework, which he calls the Seek, Sense, Share model. And that's one of his ways of visualizing it for us. And actually, we're going to be talking more about this in the interactive session afterwards. So I'm just going to give you the high-level view of this, and we'll go into it in more detail in the next session, so that you can kind of get a feel for it. But just very briefly then, Seeking is about finding things out and keeping up to date, which includes building that network of professional colleagues so that it doesn't just allow us to pull information, but they can push stuff to us as well. Sensing in the middle is a bit about how we personalize information and use it. And so sensing includes things like reflection and putting into practice what we've learned. And sharing, of course, includes exchanging resources, ideas, and experiences with our networks, as well as collaborating with their colleagues. But as Harold says, and I think this is really a key part of it, that PKM, personal knowledge management, is our part of the social learning contract. So it's actually the fundamental building block of social learning. In order to be socially learn or learn socially, we need to have these good practices or processes in place for it to happen. So what does this mean then for education? Education up to now has pretty much been about delivering learning, codifying it all up, organizing it, structuring and delivering it, delivering stuff to our heads. But in the new world of work, we need to start to help to build these new skills for the workplace. We need to start to help to build this social competence within a PKM framework to prepare students for the new world of work. So it's not about just adding social media onto ad hoc onto courses and things because it's a trendy thing to do. We need to be kind of building that fundamental skills that people are going to need to learn the new and make sense of the world and learn socially when they get into the workplace. Now, universities are beginning to recognize that these are key skills, and in fact, last year, Harold and I were approached by Bangor University in North Wales. I've just put a picture there of the UK for you, just point out where it is, where you can see right on the top of North Wales before you get to Anglesey. I can try this bit. That's it. And the psychology department, the head of the psychology department had been on one of our PKM online workshops, and he realized that this was a key skill for his students and for his staff as well. So he asked us to come and help them think about how the staff could start to embed PKM practices into the curriculum. So it wasn't going to be considered as a separate subject, you know, you take it as a core, another module. It had to be embedded into everything that they were going to teach and require students to do. And so there were actually a couple of parts to what we did. First of all, we needed to explain the rationale for PKM. Now, the head of the department was obviously understood the importance of it, but the staff, first of all, had to understand what the importance was and understand what this framework meant. So we had to work through with them the different facets of seek and sense and share for themselves before we could even get started with thinking about how they then used this or applied this within their curriculum. And we talked about how they, as individuals, needed to start building their own professional networks of people in their industry or profession, but also how in the special area of psychology that students were working in, how they needed to start that process in the university, to start building that network so that when they even went into the workplace, they'd already established that very key part of their professional lives. And thirdly, it was also about them helping the individuals to seek out new opportunities to keep up to date, helping them to identify valuable resources, blogs, web feeds of special interest, and to start that process and start to draw on that stuff for their assignments and work in the university. So not just to rely on academic literature, but to go out and start to find these resources, which in the future they would need to continue to do it as psychologists. And then, of course, help them to make sense of it all by applying the filters to filter out the noise from the signals, so synthesize what they found, analyze it, validate it, and present what they found. And then, of course, encourage them to share what they'd learned with their others, both internally, that probably started in the early years of their work in the university, sharing internal blogs or slide sets on SlideShare and so forth, perhaps within their own groups, but ultimately to share this publicly with the outside world. And actually, Bangor University already had some good examples of how students' blogs had been picked up by external experts and how students had actually been given jobs on the basis of their own thinking. In fact, I think one of the students was, one professor from another university called on this student, didn't realize they were just a student doing this work, thought there was some academic working in the field, but because of it, they actually was able to get a job in the field. And then finally, to help them build their personal brand, because we hear a lot about personal branding, but this is obviously a key thing. You can do this activity, but then you've got to be able to promote yourself in some way. It might be blogging. It might need to use other means, other channels to do so. But in order to set themselves up ready to take part in the workplace. Now, I'm just going to ask Harold here, because he obviously was part of that process, what his thoughts were on that, the whole concept of embedding PKM into the curriculum.
Am I good for sound here? Well, pick it up. Snap off. That works there? Okay. Interesting thing about Bangor University, which I'd never even heard of, because the only Bangor I know is in Maine, which is next door to me in New Brunswick, and we're under about 3 feet of snow right now, just so you know. Is that they're a world-renowned psychology department. They're one of the top psychology schools. But as Jane was saying, is that they realized that the half-life of what they were teaching was decreasing, and that they would not be able to maintain their position of being the top school unless they helped prepare their students on graduation to be able to adapt to this new world. And of course, is that their students didn't all go the same path. They didn't all go clinical. You know, they went into business, they went into sociology, or a whole bunch of different areas. So they had contacted us, and they realized that, and they also realized a couple of other things. One is that they couldn't help their students become better professional learners and take control of their professional development unless they did it first. So they understood that they had to understand the new behavior, and they had to model the new behavior. Right? And that was most of our work was on that. Their long-term goal is to work seeking, sense-making, and sharing into the curriculum so that when a student graduates, they can take control of their professional development, they become autodidacts, and they can move on and continue learning and understanding the whole social aspect of that. And as Jane mentioned, with some people actually being able to get jobs out of it. So the ROI is pretty significant on that. But really what it was a culture shift driven by seeing that the world was changing and that they moved with it. So it was a really good university to work with.
Thanks, Harold. So that's PKM. We've looked at it as an individual concept. We've looked at how education play a part. The question now then, what does it mean for organizations, for the workplace itself? For those who are working in the workplace will recognize that most areas, or the area of work that learning professionals concentrate or focus on is the training, or e-learning if you like it, the delivery aspects about structuring and directing learning for people, creating stuff, delivering it, managing it, controlling it, putting in a learning platform. This stuff on the right-hand side, this professional learning, is pretty much not something that they tend to focus on. In fact, it's the unstructured, self-directed learning we've been talking about. And in many ways, they think that if they started to encourage this, what would happen would people get good at what they were doing and go off and get another job. So they tend not to want to worry about it. But in fact, it's probably the opposite. If organizations, and some of them are, some more organizations began to think about how they could support learning the new within their organization, they'd probably be able to retain people better, because they would be the individual would see that the organization actually thinking about them, and they're thinking about their long-term future, thinking about where this is going to go, but them as individuals, but also as an organization. But actually, I think there is another real important reason why helping and supporting individuals learn the new within a professional context, within an organization, is because we need to share that information. The organizations can no longer cope with just regurgitating the same information inside the organization. They need to have new blood, new thinking coming in all the time. And so helping people acquire that information, that seeking part and the sensing part, but also now helping them to share it within the organization. And for many of us who are out on the web sharing things, it seems a very easy and trivial thing to do, but actually, working with organizations, the sharing part is actually pretty difficult. Many people don't know why they should share, what they should share, how they should share it, when they should share it. They have all kinds of questions. So for many, it's still a big area of work that needs to be done. And it's probably a fairly different type of work. It is very different type of work from what learning and development professionals are used to, which, as I say, is very much about organizing stuff on the left-hand side, rather than trying to support this unstructured knowledge sharing and learning that's happening in the workplace. And now, one thing that's been pretty much significant in the last few years for organizations is that we're seeing the emergence of new enterprise social networks, things like Yammer and Jive and Socialcast and so forth. Now, they have either been voluntarily adopted by individuals just using these tools for their own learning. In fact, Yammer comes in about number 20 on the top 100 tools list, primarily because people have gone out and been able to sign up for an account pretty quickly and start sharing stuff with their colleagues. In others, they've been sort of forced on the organization top down, and then it hasn't tended to work quite so well, because as I said in that panel yesterday, you can't force people to share. You can't make sharing compulsory or being social compulsory. But I'm digressing a bit, I'll come back to that. And what's different about these platforms, of course, is that they're actually quite similar to public social networking tools, and in as much as at their core lies this activity stream. And that supports this constant stream or flow of real-time, threaded conversation, which happens through updates and replies. And in fact, for many organizations, this flow of, or this activity stream has now replaced the old school sort of discussion forum as the way in which people have conversations. So it's just an ongoing conversations. In fact, one of the questions yesterday, of course, was about replacing email. And for many commentators anyway, believe that ESNs will ultimately replace email as the primary vehicle for employee communication. So organizations have these platforms. Many of the people are using these quite willingly and freely. Others need help in using them. And one of the key things I think is important to recognize is that we can't actually train people to social. As I said, you can't force them to be social. We can't actually train people to be social. We can only show them what it's like to be social. I'm repeating again what Harold said. You know, it's got to come from us being social to help others be social. You know, you can train people to use the functionality of Yammer or something, but actually doesn't actually solve the problem. It's about working with them to understand how to do that in the context of their own work. And so these are the new skills that learning professionals are going to need to help people share. And the kind of sharing that I'm thinking about here is what learning out loud is one of the terms that's used. Sharing what they learn. I think that they've gone out on their networks, they found stuff of interest, and they bring it back and share it with their teams. But again, as we'll be talking about later on, it's not about just sharing any old stuff. It's about thinking, is this the right place to share it, and adding some value to what they share, and helping people share things by connecting the dots as well. But more than that, it's about working out loud, which Harold talked about on the panel yesterday as well, sharing what they're doing, sharing experiences. So there's a whole different ways and approaches to sharing. And this is kind of the area that helping leaders model their behavior, because it's not just going to be learning professionals. Leaders are going to need to lead the way. Again, you can't say, right, you team, get on and share together, share things, but I'm just going to sit back and watch it all happen. They've got to lead the whole way. So I'll bring you back to this slide here that I showed you earlier. This work on the right-hand side is actually quite difficult, or quite a big leap for many people working in learning and development, moving into that way of supporting teams and individuals to work continuously and autonomously and socially. And it's very different roles, encouraging them, enabling it, supporting them, not necessarily managing and controlling them. So there is that bit in the middle, that white bit in the middle, there's a gap in the middle. And I think that many people want to kind of find a middle way, a middle approach to kind of move towards that right-hand side because they can't take that big bridge. And I called that area in the middle connected learning. And this, as I say, bridges the gap between that directed, structured learning, the knowledge transfer, the delivery of content, and so forth. That's been the way many of us have operated towards supporting the unstructured, self-directed knowledge sharing. And within organizational context, actually, the enterprise social network is actually an ideal platform to do this. Whereas in the past, we've seen learning content siloed in learning platforms, we can now use the very same platforms that we're using for working to support learning. And so we really are getting learning is working is learning, or working is learning is working. And by integrating some of these new connected approaches, which you can see are much more about knowledge co-creation, people coming together and working on collaborating, working together, rather than kind of pushing everything down to people. These are actually ideal platforms to do that. And in my view, that any learning and development people that get into this kind of area are now can support learning across the whole workplace in much bigger ways and have a much bigger impact on organizational learning than ever before, which is very much sitting about on the left-hand side. So what does this connected learning look like? Well, I've been working with some teams around the world to look at some of the ways they can start thinking about connected learning. And I think there are 5 key elements of what makes it different from perhaps traditional training. And those principles are, first of all, building or scaffolding a framework for learning to take place. So rather than packaging it all up into a neat parcel where all the content is there, it's actually just providing a bare bones skeletal framework for learning to take place. Not kind of putting the flesh on the skeleton, that comes from the people working together and collaborating and so forth. It's also about providing opportunities for self-direction and self-governance. One of the questions of the panel yesterday was about control, and I said that people on the right-hand side who are very, very self-directed, that's fine, but there are many people who need help to move towards that position. They are not comfortable with doing that. They're not happy to do that. So by providing a framework to do that, we can start to move them slowly towards self-governance, promoting self-direction, so forth. But thirdly, it's also about content. And from my view, it's using content to support social and collaborative learning rather than the other way around. So we don't just add content. Sorry, we don't just add social round content. We don't just get a course and add a community on it because it's the good thing to do. We think about how we can use content to support the whole social interaction. And of course, in the workplace, it really all has to be about what people can do at the end of the day. It needs to be performance-oriented rather than just learning for its own sake. Now, in the book, I talk a lot about a number of different ways that can happen. Far too many for me to talk about here today, but obviously things like back-channel learning, using the back channel to learn, connect people together, ongoing, social workshops are the kind of things that Harold and I have been running over years, which is not about providing all the content, but bringing people together to talk and discuss and in an open way about what they're learning and sharing what they're learning with one another. But I just thought I'd show you as an example something that I've been working on with some organizations over the last few weeks, really, It very much is a probe, as Howard would say. It's a pilot, you know, one of those under the radar things to see how it works, test it out. And it's one of the things that kind of falls between the directed learning and the self-directed learning. And I've been calling it a learning flow. And for me, a learning flow is a continuous, steady stream of social micro-learning activities. Micro-learning's become quite important, you know, trendy thing to do, I suppose, now, basically because we need to cut things down to short chunks. But I'm not talking about just content here. I'm talking about providing a very short social learning experience on a regular basis and providing that, pushing that down for people to do. And to explain what I'm talking about, I used that analogy that JSB came up with about the ships and the whitewater kayakers. So there's our ship. That's how we would normally do our courses. We would get everybody on board and we would drive them around or sail around the ocean on our ship. Everything's organized, entertainment on board. You know, you do everything the way, you can't get off the boat. You have to wait till you get to port and so forth. That's the old model of doing things. But earlier I showed you the new model of learning, which is out on the whitewater, kayaking, a very turbulent place to be, fast-flowing stream of knowledge. And for many of us, we've had to learn how to do that out on the social web. We've done that over the past, however many years that we've been on it. But for many people just coming onto that, it's quite a new experience. So how can we support them? Well, this middle road is equivalent to, say, becoming on a bigger raft, if you like, where there's some guide who can guide the way, steer the way through the waters, where we can learn together. So there's other people there collaborating. So we collectively make our way through this stream of knowledge, helping one another understand it and building confidence and competence in using perhaps the social web and navigating areas and becoming and knowledge sharing all at the same time. So it's a kind of, that whole aspect of a guide in the whole process is quite key to the area. But that guide isn't somebody directing people, it's just providing as much enablement, support, encouragement that's required for those people to work together and make their way down the stream. So what does a learning flow look like? Well, I've been experimenting with a number of different ones, and I've got a couple out there in the public domain, which you're willing to have a look at and see what you think about. I put one on Twitter, and if you go on Twitter, it's called The Learning Flow. That's the account. And what I do every day on Twitter is I tweet out twice a day, I tweet out a social micro-learning activity on learning-related news. And the way that we have the conversation is through the hashtag, through the hashtag, which is there. So it's not an ideal mechanism. You need to have some other tools perhaps to bring conversation together. But it's in 140 characters, it makes you think. You've got a little bit of context, perhaps some reading to do, and perhaps a question or a discussion item for people to participate, to share their knowledge, and so forth. So that's been an interesting one. I've also used exactly the same content on Facebook page. I've used a Facebook page. This, of course, makes it much easier to have that conversation because you can have the discussion forum, discussions underneath the entries. And it's a Facebook page, so you don't actually have to be a Facebook member if you don't want to get it, but you can go and view it. But I see this, as I say, each of these activities as sort of three parts. You know, something to read, something to think about, and something to discuss. And if you drip feed that on a regular basis, you're actually providing an awful lot of support and information and opportunities for sharing throughout the day, throughout the year, or whatever. But to do this, you need to think small. That's 15 to 20 minutes activities. People don't want to spend more than that out of the workflow. They want to get on with their jobs. So 15, 20 minutes is probably about max. Think social. Don't just think about content. Think about how people can discuss things. Don't force it, but be flexible. Anywhere, anytime, any device, it's got to be available to anybody to take up, and they can use in whatever they want. They might not do it for a couple of days, they might come back and have a look, but this constant drip feed of information and discussion and activities is actually quite a good way of learning. And then finally, my other example is one that I've done on a social platform. I've used my own open source platform to do that, but it could very easily be done in some sort of enterprise social network like Yammer or whatever. Now, in this case, this is a standalone thread about social learning in the enterprise, and I've daily put a different activity on there for people to discuss. And again, you can see the threaded discussion there. But it could quite easily, something like this, be part of a blended program. So it could be just another part of the blend. So you might still have your core structure, but going alongside it, you might have your flow of new information. So you've got your structured course, which is the content that you've already created. But here we've got a daily, regular stream of new stuff that's coming in. And you are the curator. You've brought it in. You've chosen what should be discussed. Or in the workplace, of course, the best opportunity is actually to inject it into a team's working activity stream. So there they really don't see that piece of activity coming in is any different from work, any different from any working activity. And I think for organizations, that's one way that learning and development can really start to integrate within the workflow. Okay, so there are just a few examples. If you wanted to have a look at more, you can see some here, thelearningflow.com. I've written more about it. But as I said, that's just one example. I just wanted to show you how it differs from traditional courses. So to complete then, before we go into the next session, how do you do this? How do you get them started? Well, for many people who have been out on the web, whitewater kayaking for many years, this is sort of second nature to them, and they can easily start to help their people, students, learners, whatever you like to call them, to do this. But for others, it's going to be starting to become social for themselves. It's going to be starting to walking that social talk. And people often say to me, what do I need to do to start supporting social learning in my organization? And I say that you need to be somebody who encourages, enables, and supports knowledge sharing, collaboration across the organization, not just in training or in education. You need to be a role model, leading the way, showing the business what it is to be social, modeling those new knowledge sharing and collaboration behaviors that are required for the business or education to operate effectively in the modern world. So what we're going to do in the next session, the interactive session, is to look at some of the aspects of that. We can't cover it all. We're going to pick out a few things about PKM, becoming social, knowledge sharing, working out loud. Some of those things I've already spent time talking about today. We're going to take some activities and start to get that through working and interacting with one another on your tables and so forth. So all it remains for me to say is just a sort of a plug, if you like, for the book. If you're interested in it, it's there. I've got a copy here if you want to have a look at it. Thank you for listening, and in about 5 minutes' time, Harold will be coming up here, and we're going to start this interactive workshop, which will, as I say, takes what I've said today onto the next step. So thank you very much.
I think we'll maybe just let people stand and stretch and whatever before we start. And then Jane said that she'll take questions as we get into the next part of the event. So have a stand, rub each other's backs. Very good.
Is it?
Thank
okay.
you. Yeah.
I don't even know. I'm looking out there. Whoa.
Oh, no, you did a great job. It's great. People are wrapping it. They're wrapping their heads around this. It's just been it's a lot of it's new for them. A lot of it's repackaged for them, to think differently. So it works well.
Yeah, you take that mic then. Do we want to say about the questions about that thing you're going to say.
I can talk about that, but we
Yeah.
can also, we can start with, if there's any pressing questions, we can, from your presentation, we can start with that.
I
We can be
suspect
flexible.
they're going to be asking questions which we're going to be dealing with.
Is this on?